Welcome to Two Questions. It is my pleasure to be with Flaminia Fortunato today. Flaminia holds a Master in Conservation Restoration of Modern Materials and Media from the University of the Arts in Bern, Switzerland. Amongst her many experiences in media conservation, Flaminia was the Andrew W. Mellon Fellow in Media Conservation at MoMA in New York as part of their Media Initiative project. Later, she was also a Media Conservation Fellow at the Brooklyn Museum in New York. Since 2020, Flaminia is time-based media conservator at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. She is the first person to hold this newly created position at the Stedelijk, and with her team, she is caring for over 2,000 media artwork. So again, welcome. Thank you so much for meeting with me. And I have my two questions for you. One, can performance be conserved? If so, how? And if not, why? And two, what does it mean to conserve performance? Thank you, Flaminia. Up to you.
Thank you so much for having me and inviting me to this lovely initiative, and for the introduction. It's always really nice to hear and a little bit strange too. So I think the question, and I've been listening to other colleagues talking about this in the Two Questions series, so I feel I don't want to reinvent the wheel, but just extend upon what other colleagues have said, and also in my role and from my perspective. So to the first question, can performance art be preserved? Yes, I think there is a possibility to conserve performance art and to ensure that performance can be presented in different moments of the biography of the work. And this comes from my perspective at the Stedelijk Museum, but also when I was a fellow at MoMA, we also had worked on performance art. But I do have also other perspectives that I thought were also very interesting, that didn't come from a museum perspective, but but more from a performance festival that takes place in New York, Performa. And I thought it was very interesting, one performance that was recreated. So after 30 years of in between the first iteration of the work and then the recreation, the historical recreation of the work with the artist. So there are ways, I think, that through presentation, conservation can be activated. And in a museum setting, this is very much the case. If I think about the Michele Rizzo performance Higher, that the museum has collected when it was first shown in 2016. And then we worked alongside the curator Karen Archie, who was there before my tenure, and she created a very, very thick documentation for this work, but also investigating works such, investigating questions such as, can the artist, what happens to the artist when he's not there? And thinking about documenting that in a written document. So to have two sort of sides of the acquisition, one which is the if the artist is alive, and then investigating the question what happens if the artist is not alive with the artist, which I thought was a very interesting approach. And then last year we also there was the second iteration of the work, or the artist was asked to re-perform the work. And in this iteration, there was also very important momentum to reconsider the documentation and thinking retrospectively about the history of the work, and also together with you. You were also involved in this project. I think it was very interesting to unravel some of these questions with the artist and thinking creatively about what really means to conserve this work. And I think Elia had mentioned that there is a lot of potential and imagination that we need to think about when we think about conservation. And I think this also comes from my training in Bern, where my mentor and teacher, Agatha Yarkits, was always encouraging us to think creatively about what conservation means, and also how we can approach conservation for each work in different ways. And I think that really speaks and plays an important role in performance, because every performance is different. And together with the artist also, there are so many different ways of thinking about conservation, and also expanding the definition of conservation, what conservation entails. And also what Kate Lewis has said about we shall present the work in order to be part of the conservation and build upon the biography of the work. I really agree very much with that. And there are works that are much more complicated, like the Tino Segal one, that was actually the first true acquisition of the Stedelijk Museum. So very little has been documented about that. And so also that, I think it's a very interesting case to think about and to challenge the definition of conservation when the artist is not necessarily aligned or agree with specific practice that the museum is formally might activate. So documentation, for example, or interviews. So it becomes even more ephemeral, the process itself of acquiring this work. And yeah, the range of possibility is very wide, but I do believe that there is a lot of potential for us to think more creatively about what conservation actually is and how the museum can activate that. And what does it mean to conserve performance art? Yeah, this is a very good question. Activating thoughts and comfort zones that we are not used to. And as also Elia said, I think this can happen many other moments of dealing with artworks in contemporary art. But I think for performance, it's even the process, for example, of in my experience, I was also part of the making of exhibitions. And one part of the exhibition also entailed the performance program, and I was very much involved in in working with Alexis Blake for a performance that was presented at the Prix de Rome, which is a very important prize in the Netherlands and competition between artists. And Alexis Blake was then the winner of this competition. And even though we didn't acquire the performance, the process of being involved in the performance and rehearsal, as we did also for Michele Rizzo, I think for me became a very important process of embodied knowledge, and also how do we work with artists in a way that is actually quite different. And the type of conversation we had were so enlightening. And even though they weren't documented, I thought that they had to do a lot with this process of empathy and understanding a little bit the nunchi of the room. And nunchi, I think I mentioned to you once, is this concept in Korean culture that is almost like an emotional intelligence, what it would be in Western culture. And the idea that by being with artists and understanding very specific challenges in the space, you can, as a conservator, shift the way of behaving with them. And I think this is also something very, very thin almost ephemeral in itself, because it's a behavior based, it's not practice based, that I thought in other instances it didn't happen in the same way. Also talking about evaluating the performance, looking at it together, the way of seeing together, the so-called, I love how Isaac Julian, British video artist, talk about the poetics of attention, the idea of just in the idea of the relationship with commemoration and attention to rhythm, that I think performance art really very much activates. And I don't know if I'm answering the question. I'm just providing maybe some food for thoughts about my personal experience with performance, even though not institutionalized performance, so performance that is being acquired, but more the occasions I've been working with artists and performance. And then, of course, there is the very interesting aspect of how performance is being defined, even in our museum database. And that is also goes back to the question how it was defined, how it was conserved, and how we grapple with definitions and navigating something that is much more difficult and challenging to define. So in a way, I think it's a very compelling way of working as a conservator to be dealing with performance art. And I'm grateful for all of these occasions that have happened to reflect upon my practice, but not only my practice in the more practical terms, but also my behavior in a much more holistic way, and also my culture and what we are used to, this kind of interesting way of wanting to define things. And sometimes performance has the power to challenge also those definitions and moving, I think, also the field of conservation much forward. Yeah, that's right. I didn't mention in my humble answers my experience with dance and my own biography, because when we talk about biography of artwork, sometimes in a setting such as this, we'd also forget to think about our own biography and how that impacts the way we approach biography for artworks. Yeah, and I think that for me, the one very important point about the Michele Rizzo in the trying to rehearse with him was to really think about the memory of the movement and the dexterity of being able to develop and master that movement to a level then it is accepted for the performance itself. And I think that is something that is also from a conservator perspective, to be able to see through the eyes of the artist, how the artists are looking through the performers rehearsing. It's a very important moment in the way of analyzing what are the fundamental aspects of the performance and the movement. And I think it was a very interesting way for all of us, and also to have you being part of this process of also re-interviewing the artist, because I always find fascinating to expand upon much bigger reflection that sometimes when you're babies in your daily practice of museum, you forget the oversight of things. And for me, having this cross-fertilization with other researcher, it's a very beautiful moment to really broaden the self-reflection we have on our own way of doing things. So I felt extremely inspired by this process of doing it together. And and also asking specific question to the artist and just doing this very small collaboration, if I may call it this way. Yeah, and in me there is a little bit this kind of a dichotomy, almost this dualism of the scientific side and then the more emotional side, which comes from dance and maybe also my attitude towards movement and understanding movement. So I feel extremely, I think it's a very interesting process to work on performance art as part of media conservation more broadly.